Dr. Sarah Chun pulled her thermal jacket tighter as the bitter wind cut across the frozen landscape of Kepler 442c. The research station's lights flickered behind her like dying stars in the perpetual twilight of the ice world's winter season. She checked her scanner again, following the faint energy signatures that had been detected 3 kilometers from the base. The Galactic Research Council had established this outpost to study the unique crystalline formations that grew beneath the planet's frozen surface. What they hadn't expected to find were the Valkyrie, a primitive species that resembled a cross between wolves and bears, with thick silver fur and intelligent amber eyes. The creatures had been observed from a distance, but direct contact was forbidden under galactic law until a full behavioral study could be completed. Sarah's breath formed ice crystals in the air as she trudged through knee-deep snow. The storm had been raging for 6 days, and temperatures had dropped to -40°C. Even with her advanced heating suit, she could feel the cold trying to seep into her bones. She couldn't imagine how any creature could survive in this environment without proper shelter. Her scanner chirped, indicating she was close to the source of the readings. The signal seemed to be coming from a rocky outcropping ahead, where several large boulders formed a natural cave system. As she approached, she noticed strange markings in the snow, tracks that looked like they belonged to the Valkyrie, but smaller than any she had seen in the expedition files. Sarah crouched down and examined the tracks more closely. They were definitely Valkyrie, but much smaller, perhaps belonging to juveniles. The tracks led directly to the cave entrance, but there had been no movement in or out for at least 2 days, judging by the layer of fresh snow that had accumulated over them. She activated her comm unit. Base camp, this is Chun. I'm at the source of the energy readings. Appears to be a natural cave formation with signs of Valkyrie habitation. The voice of Commander Morrison crackled through the speaker. Copy that, Chun. Remember, observation only. We can't risk first contact protocols being violated. Understood, sir. Sarah switched off the comm and approached the cave entrance carefully. The opening was barely large enough for her to crawl through, and she had to remove her backpack to fit. As she squeezed inside, her helmet's lights illuminated rough stone walls covered in a thin layer of ice. The cave was larger inside than it appeared from the entrance, opening into a chamber about the size of a small room. What she saw next made her heart skip a beat. In the far corner of the cave, huddled together in a pile of dried vegetation and fur, were 3 small Valkyrie cubs. They couldn't be more than a few weeks old, their eyes still closed, their small bodies trembling violently despite being pressed against each other for warmth. Their silver fur was dull and matted, and Sarah could see their tiny rib cages rising and falling with rapid, shallow breaths. She stood frozen for a moment, taking in the scene. Where were the parents? Valkyrie were known to be devoted to their young, never leaving them alone for extended periods. Something must have happened to the adults. Sarah activated her scanner to get more detailed readings. The cubs' body temperatures were dangerously low, barely registering on the thermal sensors. At this rate, they wouldn't survive another night. The cave provided some protection from the wind, but it was still far too cold for young mammals to survive without a heat source. She looked around the cave for any signs of the parents. Near the entrance, she found something that made her stomach drop. Scattered bones, picked clean and partially buried under debris. The remains were too small to be adult Valkyrie, but there were metal fragments mixed in with the bones, pieces that looked like they came from hunting traps. The picture became clear. The parents had been caught in illegal hunting traps, probably set by poachers from one of the mining operations in the outer system. With their parents dead, these cubs had been left to fend for themselves in the brutal cold. They had maybe hours left before hypothermia claimed them. Sarah's hands moved to her comm unit, then stopped. If she reported this, the bureaucratic process would take days. Forms would need to be filed, committees would need to meet, and protocols would need to be established. The cubs would be dead long before any official action could be taken. She knelt down beside the pile of fur and vegetation. The cubs stirred slightly at her presence, but were too weak to show fear. One of them, slightly larger than the others, opened its eyes for a moment. The amber irises were cloudy with exhaustion and cold, but there was still a spark of life there. Sarah made her decision. She activated her suit's emergency beacon and began gathering dried vegetation and small pieces of wood that were scattered around the cave. Working quickly, she arranged them in a small pile near the cubs and activated a chemical fire starter from her emergency kit. The flame caught immediately, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. The cubs stirred more actively as the warmth began to spread, their tiny bodies instinctively moving closer to the heat source. Sarah fed more material into the fire, building it up until it filled the cave with blessed warmth. But even as the fire blazed, she realized it wouldn't be enough. The cubs needed constant care and feeding, and someone would need to maintain the fire throughout the night. The storm outside was getting worse, and temperatures were still dropping. She looked at her thermal suit's power indicator. At maximum heating, she had maybe 8 hours of power left. If she turned the heating down to minimum, she could stretch it to perhaps 12 hours. But that would mean enduring the brutal cold herself. Sarah looked at the cubs again. The largest one had managed to lift its head and was looking directly at her with those intelligent amber eyes. There was something almost human in that gaze, a recognition of her as a source of help and comfort. She began removing equipment from her pack, setting up a proper camp around the fire. Her emergency shelter was designed for one person, but if she positioned it correctly, it could help reflect heat from the fire back toward the cubs while providing some protection from the cave's drafts. As she worked, Sarah found herself talking to the cubs in a soft, soothing voice. "It's okay, little ones. I'm here now. We're going to get through this together." The cubs seemed to respond to her voice, their trembling subsiding slightly as the cave continued to warm. Sarah arranged her sleeping bag so that it formed a barrier between the cubs and the cold cave wall, then settled down beside the fire to begin her vigil. Outside, the storm howled with renewed fury, but inside the cave, 3 small lives hung in the balance, dependent entirely on the compassion of a species they had never encountered before. Sarah checked her suit's power levels one more time, then reduced the heating to minimum. It would be a long, cold night, but she was determined to see these cubs through to morning. She added another piece of wood to the fire and pulled her jacket tighter around herself. In a few hours, when her body heat began to drop, she would need to make an even more difficult decision. But for now, she watched over the sleeping cubs and planned how she could keep them alive until help arrived. The amber eyes of the largest cub reflected the firelight as it drifted off to sleep, finally, warm for the first time in days. Sarah smiled despite her growing exhaustion. Sometimes, she thought, the most important scientific discoveries weren't about data or protocols. Sometimes they were simply about recognizing life that needed to be saved and having the courage to act. The fire crackled softly in the cave as the storm raged outside, and Sarah began the long watch that would test not just her endurance, but her humanity itself. The fire had burned low twice during the night, and each time Sarah had forced herself to crawl from her inadequate shelter to feed it more fuel. Her thermal suit's power indicator now flashed red, showing less than 2 hours of heating remaining. The cave temperature had risen from deadly cold to merely uncomfortable, but it wasn't enough. The cubs needed more warmth if they were going to survive until rescue arrived. Sarah's hands shook as she checked the cubs' conditions. Their breathing was stronger now, more regular, but they were still far too cold. The largest cub, the one she had mentally nicknamed Hope, was able to lift its head and even made small mewing sounds when she approached. The other 2, however, remained motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of their chests. She looked at her remaining supplies. The chemical fire starters were nearly exhausted, and the available fuel in the cave was running low. Even if she could keep the fire burning, she wasn't generating enough heat to truly warm the space. The cubs needed something more. Sarah stared at her thermal suit's controls for a long moment, then began shutting down all non-essential systems. The heads-up display went dark, followed by the communication array, and, finally, the emergency beacon. Every amp of power was now redirected to the heating elements. But even that wouldn't be enough. She looked at the cubs again, watching Hope struggle to crawl closer to the fire, and made the decision that would define everything that followed. Sarah began removing her thermal suit entirely. The cold hit her like a physical blow as she peeled away the insulated layers. Her base clothing was designed for temperature-controlled environments, offering almost no protection against the freezing air. Within seconds, she was shivering uncontrollably, but she didn't stop. She arranged the thermal suit around the cubs like a nest, activating its heating elements on full power. The suit's remaining energy would provide intense warmth for maybe 3 hours, but it would keep the cubs alive. Sarah then took her sleeping bag and wrapped it around herself and the cubs' makeshift nest, creating a shared body heat system. The effect was immediate. The cubs stirred more actively as the artificial heat surrounded them, and Hope actually managed to crawl out of the pile to investigate this strange new heat source. Sarah guided the cub back to its siblings, then positioned herself so that her body heat would supplement the thermal suit's output. As the hours passed, Sarah's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her body temperature dropped, and the shivering became violent and uncontrollable. Her fingers turned numb, making it difficult to tend the fire or adjust the cub's position. But every time she looked at them, she saw improvement. Their fur was becoming fluffier as it dried and warmed. Their breathing was deeper and more regular. Hope was even beginning to show curiosity about its surroundings. When the thermal suit's power finally died, Sarah knew she was in serious trouble. Her core temperature was dropping dangerously low, and hypothermia was setting in. She had perhaps an hour before she would lose the ability to maintain consciousness. But the cubs were now warm enough that they might survive until morning. That's when she heard it. A low, rumbling sound from the cave entrance that made Hope's ears perk up immediately. Sarah turned her head with great effort and saw amber eyes reflecting the firelight from the cave mouth. Large amber eyes, attached to a massive silver form that barely fit through the opening. An adult Valkyrie squeezed into the cave, followed immediately by a second one. Sarah's first instinct was fear, but the creatures ignored her entirely, rushing to the pile of cubs with soft whimpering sounds. The larger of the two adults, clearly the mother, began nuzzling and licking the cubs while making gentle purring noises. Sarah watched in amazement as the family reunion unfolded before her. The cubs responded immediately to their mother's presence, mewing and crawling over each other to get closer to her. The second adult, presumably the father, positioned himself protectively between the family and Sarah, though he showed no signs of aggression. As warmth returned to the cubs through their mother's body heat and milk, Sarah felt her own strength ebbing away. The extreme cold was taking its toll, and she was losing the battle against hypothermia. She tried to move closer to the fire, but her muscles wouldn't respond properly. The father Valkyrie noticed her distress. He tilted his head, studying her with those intelligent amber eyes, then did something extraordinary. He moved away from his family and approached Sarah carefully. Without any apparent fear, he positioned his large, warm body against her side, sharing his body heat. Sarah was too cold and exhausted to be amazed by the unprecedented interspecies contact. She simply accepted the warmth gratefully, pressing against the creature's thick fur as feeling slowly returned to her extremities. The Valkyrie's body temperature was higher than a human's, and his fur was incredibly efficient at